Evening or welcome back to eveonline. It's been a while. Wanted to do a video because again I get asked this all the time. It's basically how have I earned all my ISK in this game. I barely play the game at the moment, but let me give you some really quite useful tips and tricks. So don't click off because this might actually be of use to you. There's kind of a number of ways to structure this. The first one I think is to really kind of break that myth of the billionaire ceiling. A lot of people really struggle in this game to do the basics, like just having certain ships, having the ability to do certain things. And I think actually you do run the risk of getting into a bit of a difficult place with this game if you start to think ISK is the only thing that matters. I would seriously recommend never approaching it like that. There's almost kind of a number of ways to sort of think of the game in that I think have really benefited me. And the first one is to think, well, you don't set out to become a millionaire, a billionaire, or a trillionaire. You want to try and find something in the game that you enjoy that actually then pays you. That sounds very simple, doesn't it? But for me, production has always been that thing. So with everything I do in the game, I've always basically designed everything I do to be around the production. I think one of the best things that eveonline ever did was have the ability to build things and sell them for profit. So if I just run through some of the blueprints I've got, I would say almost all of the wealth I've created comes from creating things and then being clever with what you do, because you obviously produce something, you need to buy in materials. You can either mine them yourself. If you're a sucker, you can mine them. That's probably triggering quite a few of you. But the reality of it is that if you want to be super rich, you don't mine your own minerals. You buy them. This is where you start to basically live within the margins. And if you go to any sort of shop broker all the way through the chain, from small little corner shop all the way up to Walmart, everything is made and lost in the percentages, the margins, right? So let's start with that, because I think that's the beginning of really what I would say I do. Then I think we're into, interesting kind of trading and bartering. So that becomes a key part of, I think, how you make your ISK from then. Is once you've created something, you're transforming it. I like to use Animal Crossing as a good example here. If you don't know what Animal Crossing is, it's basically Eve, but with cuddly toys. And in that game, you can do all the various things like mine and fish and that, or you can just buy the things. But then basically what you do is you turn it from one thing into another. You transform it. In the business sense, you add value. And that is it. So in the process of probably my biggest investment returns was these. So building Titans earned me a fortune, because back in the day, this is pretty much how, again, they've made it really complicated now. So if I just use this blueprint, let's just have a look at it. The reality of it is back in the day, building a Titan was actually a lot easier than it is now, because there's all of these other things that you have to have, which it didn't have back in the day. It was just these blueprints, and you made these parts, and then you put them into a giant assembly, which was always at risk of being destroyed, and then you build Titan. So there's a huge risk-reward thing going on here. And I think risk-reward is the byword of this game, as you know, because I'm sure you heard it before. But definitely for Eve, there is also a risk-reward. So like with stocks, you could go all in on cap recharger 2s on the G2 market. I've seen this countless times of people trying to make huge money by buying up the market and then hoping that they can then sell at a higher profit. It sometimes works, it often doesn't. And this is, I think, the case of how I would say is you have to pick something that is actually, easy, that you enjoy doing, because again, don't do things that you don't enjoy. So if you don't enjoy ratting in this game, don't do it. It will be the quickest way to then decide that this game is not worth playing. So you might as well basically, not do that. You might as well just focus on what you actually get enjoyment from. Now, one of the areas that I really would suggest is you can do a number of things. The first one is blueprint copy production. It's not big ISK, but again, passive income. And again, a lot of these things is many fingers in many pies, so to speak. And I would say that is very true of how I became incredibly, insanely wealthy in this game, was just buying things, trying it out. So I ran blueprints of these things for an awful long time. I must have made over 20, 30 blueprints copies of the Titans, and I must have made over 100 blueprint copies of the motherships, and they basically went and be sold for huge money. So it's all about kind of understanding how to leverage the asset. Anyway, let's look at a practical example. So if I go to Invention, I like Invention. I still think it's a very good way to make good money. There's videos of me that you've seen. If you haven't, go watch them, because they basically show you the whole invention process from start to finish. I will include a link in the description. Go and have a look at it. But for me, it is by far one of the more enjoyable ways to earn money, because basically what you're doing is you're making these wonderful things, and in one run, I mean, there we go, 161 million there, just from, that's one character, that's in fact two characters, that was just basically creating things from Invention. I will go and look at that other video to see how I did it, but that to me was always a great way to, I think, have regular turnover. But I think when it comes to kind of the big ISK, blueprints are a good way to do this, but it depends really, because everything changes so often in the game. The fit of the month, the ship of the month, whatever it may be, it's very difficult to pick something that will be enduring. So you have to be a little bit smart here. So for example, let's say when I first bought the Nix, it was definitely the most popular mothership. I'm assuming it still is, but I think the Aeon is far better in terms of practicality. So weirdly, the Aeon was something I couldn't shift blueprints of for love nor money. Now, every time I make a blueprint, it flies off the market. It's bought almost instantly. And this is a good example of, I think, you have to kind of adjust your mindset of what actually is, making ISK at the time. And I think really then it comes down to one of the kind of nicer areas is then trading. So you're looking to create something. I would recommend buying things off the market and turning them into better things. An example of this is buying minerals and making modules. Now, you have to be very careful of this, because there are an awful lot of modules on the market that are actually under their minerals value or very close to it. And that's because they're probably dropped in ratting, for example. So you have to think very carefully about this. But for me, this is where I think the invention comes in. It's where, mass production of things that people need an invention that sells really well. I'll give you an example. Cargo expanded 2s are always being produced, as well are cap recharges and cap power relay 2s. So therefore, when you come to, if you want a quick, simple entryway to make some mega ISK, well, maybe not mega, but certainly good, is building things like the nanofiber internals, because they sell quite well, overdrive injector system 1s, power diagnostic system 1s. These are all things that people will, if you're making it yourself to do the invention, it's a bit of a pain, because you just use so many of them if you do large scale invention, ballistic control unit 1s. So I would even say that if you had no ISK at all and you wanted to just get started, just buy the blueprints for these basic components like eye harvester. You could show as some form of input, and you can then say, right, I'll go and buy the blueprint for XYZ and then just start producing. Now you can buy minerals through buy orders from Jita, do it as cheap as possible, and then just produce, because some of them are really, really cheap to produce, like cargo expanders. I think I've run out entirely of them. Oh, there we go. So these, I think, are just like isogen and something. So really, really simple, but look at how many I bought off the market. I mean, that's pretty straightforward. You can make a huge amount of them and just put them online, up on the market in Jita, and you'll make some good ISK. Now let's go to the other end of the scale here. So what could you be making maybe in terms of ships? So for ships, it's difficult, because again, ships have no, it's difficult to know kind of which ones are going to sell well. So things like haulers, I would recommend haulers because they're quite useful. I think that could be, definitely worth a go. I just realized I'm on I'm on an alpha clone on this account. That's incredible. That's embarrassing. A trillionaire on an alpha account. What is that about? Yeah, I'll fix that. Don't worry. Got loads of plagues, bro. Look, it's like 9,000 plagues. That's a fair bit. So I would say definitely look at things like modules to start with, then transition maybe to ships, tech one, because again, you're just going to build the things. But you have to look again and see what the demand is, because generally it tends to be whatever the current fleet fit or what's doing well in PvP will always sell well. But things like industrials, I would recommend because they generally do always sell. Then you start to get into more exotic areas. So things like you could start to buy blueprints for things like rattlesnakes. Now, not necessarily huge ISK, because again, the price of the battleship build has already been costed into the price. But it's one of those things that I do find if you build things like that and put them near ports towards 0-0 and low security space, you tend to do quite well when you do things like that. But this is definitely something to think about, because I would say when it comes to ships, particularly for Tech 1, you're always going to be able to sell certain things, Armageddons, Ravens, things like that. They're always going to do quite well. But you have to factor in the fact that it gets more complicated the bigger you get. So doing things like Rifters, you're not going to sell a huge amount of them, but eventually you will. And it really comes down to understand who you're selling to, because 9 times out of 10, if you put it on the G2 market, there'll be massive competition. But if you have a bit of an ability to just wait, this is definitely my biggest recommendation, is don't rush, don't market jump, don't 0.1 ISK below the person who just did it to you. Let them sell their stock and allow the market to recover, then sell. And you will find 9 times out of 10 that eventually things sell. It may take weeks, but I think if I could give one bit of advice, is the market manipulators, they know what they're doing and they're making good ISK doing that. But you'll make better ISK, because if you can have the ability not to tie up all of your ISK into building 5 Armageddons and waiting for them desperately to sell. That's the key. Spread your risk. If you're doing modules, then have the ability to do thousands of modules at once. Don't just go all in on expanded cargo holds, for example. And I think that, amazingly, it seems to be the way to do it. And then once you start to kind of get into kind of billionaire leagues, I think honestly start thinking about things like capital production, because the game has changed entirely on these things. When I built all the Titans, and I used to call them motherships because that's what they came out as. When I built them, they pretty much were impossible to defend. If somebody wanted the POS dead, it would be dead. It was very difficult to stop that. Then they brought in things like cyno jammers and stuff like that, and it started to become a bit easier. But the reality of it is that there's still there was a huge margin in these things. And I'll give you my avatar example here. So I used to build an avatar. I think the total mineral cost back in the day was 45 billion. Those of you who now know what Titans are worth now are laughing at that number, because that is obviously a fraction of what they're going for now. But really what's interesting to me is that actually still you could be building things like capital ships, carriers and dreadnoughts quite comfortably as a billionaire. And then when you get towards the kind of upper end of billion and then heading towards trillionaire, honestly, I would say Titans become an interesting thing to build, because I can tell you now, it's very, very unlikely you'll build a Titan and not have a buyer eventually, as long as you're not being stupid. And I'll give you an example. There's a lady across the road from me who has got a very normal detached house. And there's nothing interesting or exciting about it whatsoever. However, they have priced it as if it is literally a beautiful grand design conversion, and it's ridiculous. So the going market should be, let's say, 500,000. They've priced it 650, and I'm like, well, why have they done that? And this is the problem I think a lot of people have, is kind of short-termist greed, and they're not really thinking, well, the best thing to do would be to unlock the asset tied up. So the money that's gone into building this Titan, as an example, let's sell that for a relatively modest profit of 10% and move on. And that's what I did with all of my Titans, because to me, I had 30, 40 accounts driving a machine, keeping the production roll going. If suddenly you start to quibble and haggle over groats on the pound, then basically what you end up doing is stalling that entire system. And this happened. I actually had a few people amazingly moan at me about pricing of my Titans, and then all of a sudden the system just ground to a halt. And then, the Mittani did something stupid, but that's another story. But this is kind of like what I would say is an interesting kind of way to kind of scale that to a point. Everything comes down to niches. So if I was going to give you one example of niches, is that when I was doing Invention, right, I tried a number of different ways to track what I should build versus what was doing well in the market. And I tried a number of, evetycoon.com, I think was a website I used. Great website, no disrespect to it. But the problem is when you're building as much as I was, the problem is you can't really track that very easily. So eventually it becomes a bit of a gut feel. And I would say there is so much, particularly when I worked in the city, this is definitely something I would recommend is if you have a bit of a gut feeling about something, go with your gut, but don't go all in. Don't do like everything on Tesla because you'll lose if you do that. But I would say your gut feel is incredibly useful. And I would say that is pretty much what has got me to be a trillionaire, was understanding that, hey, certain things are definitely worth taking a bet on. And it could be as simple as buying moon minerals, morphite, for example. The morphite, way that morphite has gone over, let's say, a number. Look at that. My goodness. It's like trading stocks. Literally, this is stock market trading. So if you bought here and sold there, you're laughing. But if you bought here and then basically didn't sell, you're screwed. So this is definitely something to think about. You have to watch what the game producers do. So they're just about to buff pyrite, I believe, which again made me laugh that I logged in and there was this sort of big thumbnail that said, "We're buffing pyrite." And it just made me laugh because it's such a dumb thing to say. But there you go. That's a good example of something like, I'm guessing isogen is the problem. And this is probably why they're doing that. So let's have a look. I don't know, maybe not. But it'd be interesting to know what is it, Noxium then? There you go. I actually have no idea what the Noxiums, have a look. Nope, so nothing here particularly makes me feel that it's an unstable. So post in the comments if I missed something there. But this is kind of what you're looking to do, is you have to get quite good at this view, which, and again, it's no different to trading stocks. So those of you that do stock trading, this is very familiar to you, I'm sure. But this is basically why Eve is a wonderful platform to cut your teeth on, to really understand, how the game works. And I'll give you an example. So let's have a look at another module here. So if I take a sort of maybe a slightly different view, let's just cut that down a bit. So that is not a good module to make. Do you know why? Because there's not much instability in it. Basically you could see a large supply was done then. So somebody basically sold 226 and started to push the price up. They did a market attack, if you want to call it that. They probably bought G to market. And then since then they've been selling and so on. So that you can do it. It is possible to make it work. But honestly, I think you need to be a bit mindful. And I would say things like this tend to become the tool. So let's just think, what have we covered? So blueprints, a great starting point. Again, I cannot stress enough that blueprints very quickly become a great way to make money in this game. And I think once you start to understand some of the basics, so buying them, copying them, using the material, efficiency, production efficiency, etc. But really the reality of it is that if you're going to do copies of things like this, material efficiency is probably the key one, because that is by far the most useful. But you're producing these things really to kind of then sell the blueprint or to make the module itself. And then you start to scale up from there. So from that point forward, you could then be looking at buying minerals, making the modules, and then selling them to inventors. Because that's the key thing. You're not selling them to people to put on their ships. You're creating, medium capacitor boosters, because you know that somebody somewhere is going to need to buy them. And there you go, good example, because that actually is showing something that's rising, usually because of the mineral requirement in them. Let me just not close that. And I honestly think this is a great way. When people ask me what's the best way to get started in literally from grassroots, do that. start buying some blueprints and start getting, producing some simple things. Don't go nuts, don't go all in, and hedge your bets, because some things one day will not make good money, the others will make great money. And it's all about understanding that it's not always going to be about buying a cap recharge of one blueprint and then making thousands of them, hoping they'll sell, because there's a market capacity. And once you start to understand that, you then start to do better things. So then you start to look at things like ships, for example. So here we have some cruisers. Carousel and Thorax, I think, are pretty good options to buy, because and Blackbirds, I guess. Destroyers, if you only have the ISK for destroyers, but start to make blueprints, and then also start to maybe make some of them and start to sell them. And if you think about it, I mean, one of the key skills you need is the ability to have many sell orders and buy orders at the same time. I've done this on an account. I actually have a trading account who I think can have hundreds and hundreds of trade and buy and sell orders. I believe, I could be wrong. But and they also have all the standings and the skills, so that everything basically is reduced to its minimum as best as possible. They could be even better, but for now, that'll do. Because then that means you can start to build basically a network, and start to build and sell an awful lot of things, and then look to basically live in the margins. Because if I had, say, I don't know, 1,000 modules a day coming out, which is not unusual, that's pretty typical for when I was doing Invention, you're then putting them into the market knowing that at some point you could have probably 10,000 modules on the market that's under your sell. And yes, you could 0.1 reduce, 0.1 reduce, but if you can warrant the expense, leave it, let them cash out at a lower point selling their stock, and eventually the market does tend to recover and go up, because even in this game, inflation is a thing. So there's always a kind of an increase. So eventually things will sell. And I think that kind of then takes you to then the middle game of industry, which is then starting to look at things like cruisers, battleships. And I think ultimately, you should be looking to do capitals eventually, because this is where big ISK is earned, but it's also where there's big risk. But again, if you want to do one project an example here is I was building avatars, I think for 45 and selling them for 100, and I made one every 2 weeks. And it ridiculous. It was seriously big ISK. And I would say a lion's share of the ISK has come from there. But then again, I lost a station that CCP effed up. And I lost a station because they didn't tell me they were changing their game, because they're edgelords. And I lost hundreds and hundreds of billions of stuff. So it happens to us all. So no matter what you do in this game, there's always going to be something that will just come along and kick you square in the knackers. And I think sometimes you just have to accept it, dust yourself off, and keep moving forward. And if all else fails, you can just sell basically clothes, because look, that's 1.4 billion for an eye patch or a monocle, or whatever it is, a patch of some kind. Amazing, isn't it? Absolutely amazing that that's a thing. Let's just have a quick look at that. 1.4, oh my days, that's kind of cool, actually. I should totally put that on my character, shouldn't I? But there we go. I just find it incredible that really everything has the ability to make ISK. I think it's definitely about understanding where you can just pull that ISK from. And it could even be that you just do ship trading. Nice and simple, buy low, sell high. But I think these are kind of the frameworks that I've used. And I like to call it the Trillionaire mindset. So you can guess what sort of videos are about to come now. But I would say there's an awful lot to be said about buying low, selling high, having a bit of time, and never overextend yourself. And before you know it, you could have 100 buy orders, 100 sell orders, and it looks like you've never got any ISK, because you'll look at your wallet and see very little number in there. But that means you're doing well. If you've got a high amount of ISK in a wallet sat doing nothing, it's technically just dead. It's dead money. It's not doing anything. It's not earning you anything. You should be putting your money to work. And I think that's a great example. So if you suddenly log in and you see you have 1 billion ISK, go and put 1 billion ISK of very low buy orders on the market. Be careful, because they do cost ISK. But if you're smart and clever, then when you next log in, you'll have something to then repost, reuse, upgrade, add value to, invent, and then you can make even more money. So there we go. That was that was Beyond Trillionaire, eveonline industrial scaling secrets from a trillionaire who doesn't even have an Omega account. unbelievable. Hope you enjoyed that. See you next time.